Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura Rabinow. I'm the Deputy Director of Research here at the Rockefeller Institute, as well as the Director of our internship program at the Center for Law and Policy Studies Solutions. I'm excited to have this distinguished panel of scholars, practitioners, and policy advocates here with us today, some of them all three, just before Earth Day, to discuss environmental justice policy and new policy directions. Just to give everybody an overview of our agenda today, I'll introduce our first panelist and keynote speaker momentarily before they share some opening thoughts and background on environmental justice policy in the United States and in New York. Once they give their remarks, I'll then introduce each of our other panelists and give you a chance to hear from them about the work that they do before we move on to our question and answer session. So without further ado, and so that we leave as much time as possible for conversation, our keynote today is being delivered by Dr. Lamir Turan, an assistant professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in the Department of Environmental Studies, where his research has focused on urban sustainability, climate change and legacy pollution, and energy justice. Welcome.
Thank you, Laura. And I'll start with a question. I don't know who made the mistake of making me the keynote with this serious panel, but I'll blame it on you. But in all seriousness, very glad to be here today. And let's go ahead and get started because I realize we have limited time. All right, hopefully that's visible to the folks. Thumbs up, Laura. I'm good, okay. So just very briefly regarding my work, it was mentioned in the introduction, but my work centers on three themes. Number one, why we're here today, energy and environmental justice. So I do a lot of things in relation to life cycle assessment, that is cradle to the grave thinking and environmental justice broadly, energy and beyond. When I was doing my postdoc at FAMU, Florida A&M University, shout out to HBCUs, I developed something called the Toxic Mobilities Inventory. And in this space, I really think a lot about, well, do you have a legacy pollution problem in your backyard, a brownfield in your backyard? Well, guess what? As a consequence to climate change, that brownfield may be coming to a hood near you. We can talk about that a little bit later, maybe in the discussion section. And then finally, I spend a lot of time thinking about urban transition, cities, climate change, climate planning within an urban context. So I realize we may have a general audience, so just wanted to begin with a broad definition and a very potent definition as to what is environmental justice. And I think APEN, some friends out on the West Coast, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, I think they offer a very helpful definition as to what environmental justice is. So just work with me here. EJ is the right to a decent, safe quality of life for people of all races, incomes, and cultures, in the environments where we live, work, play, learn, and pray. And I think that rub is really in the last part, where we live, work, play, learn, and pray. And just another way we can think about this, maybe in a little bit less esoteric context, it's how structural inequality influences our environments, right? How structural inequality influences our environments. And I always say, because the discourse has evolved over the last couple of decades, the elephant is we used to be very good at talking about environmental racism, and we don't do that so much anymore. So I always say the elephant when it comes to, we're going to be talking a lot about policy today. Are we comfortable in this discourse? Do we just talk in a very milquetoast fashion about inequality and justice? Or are we going to be willing to get to the roots of some of these problems? And if we keep on using language and discourse to deodorize these problems, then we're never going to have equality in New York State or beyond. And I always say this, since we are in an academic context, I never go to any campus in this country or anywhere across the planet. I always lead with a very simple question. If we're talking environmental justice, because I do a lot of talks in environmental science spaces, sustainability spaces, very simple. What does a Black woman have to do to become a professor at this university? And you may think that that's not, well, what does that have to do with environmental justice? Well, go back to what APEN's definition is. We're talking about where we live, work, play, learn, pray. Now, I don't want anybody in this house today to use this very cynically. We can get caught up in the politics of representation, tokenism. That's not the point. But unless we start to adequately address what our campuses look like, who's doing the research, who's at the table, then we're just playing justice. We're just talking justice. We're not really doing the work. So real quick, I was asked to do a real quick discourse on some influential policy on the federal and state level. So let's run through this. First off, late 60s, inaugurated in 1970, January 1st, you had the National Environmental Policy Act. Very helpful in allowing us to think about environmental problems, specifically in environmental justice communities in relation to cumulative impacts. So when we're talking about the cumulative effects and impacts of problems, you're not just, if you're thinking about a planning situation, the redevelopment of a highway next door, or any type of project where the federal government is going to be involved, federal money's involved, we need to be thinking about cumulative impacts, right? You're not just thinking about the environmental dimensions of a singular decision that's being made. You're thinking about easements. You're thinking about past legacies of inequality. You're thinking about noise pollution, air inequality, displacement of people. And then in the mid-1990s, you had Executive Order 12898. In 12898, we're going to spend some time talking about this, I think, in the discussion today, the inadequacies. But just real quick, 12898 did three things. So the first thing it did, it really mandated or forced the federal government to deal with disproportionate environmental impacts and effects, at least on paper. You have to, when you're thinking about environmental decision-making, you have to start thinking about how marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted and affected by environmental decision-making. Second thing it did, it enabled an intra-agency mechanism to start thinking about these problems, right? So your agencies are going to have to start talking to each other specifically about environmental injustice, environmental inequality. And then the final thing it did was it really gave some language. It didn't create the language. I don't want anybody to get it twisted today, but it gave us some language for thinking about public participation in planning processes. So what does meaningful involvement mean? What does community impact mean? What does access mean? What does informed consent mean? Let's move on to EO 13175. And a lot of times we won't necessarily talk about this in environmental justice discourse, but very meaningful, I think, because this is an executive order that really gives attention to Native communities in relation to when you're engaging in public processes, there needs to be a respectful and healthy amount of discourse related to tribal consultation. And there also is deference given to self-determination, sovereignty for Native peoples, federally recognized Native peoples in this country. And then finally, the most recent of these just came into effect within the last couple of months. You have Executive Order 14008, and it touches a lot of things in relation to environmental justice. So let me just stream off a few things. Number one, it established the Justice 40 Initiative, and germane to New York State. A lot of the language from 14008 came directly from New York State. Justice 40 Initiative, this is going to look familiar to New Yorkers. It does things in relation to 40% of the givebacks in relation to clean and efficient energy programming and environmental programming that needs to go to disadvantaged communities. And we're going to talk about the problem of that language of disadvantaged communities, but it definitely sets a template for that. Once again, language adopted from New York State. What else does it do? Climate change procurement policies. So when you're thinking about federal spending in relation to climate change, there definitely is a cognizance and recognition of procurement and purchasing that gives deference to the realities of climate change. Department of Justice is going to make environmental justice it's not just going to make it a policy, but it's going to make it a priority and a focus of the DOJ's work. Now, some of the problems related to that, from administration to administration, you may see ebbs and flows in terms of the attention that the DOJ gives. And it does other things in relation to broader environmental concerns outside of environmental justice. Let me just name a couple. Eliminates fossil fuel subsidies in the coming years, renewed attention to renewable energy on public lands. So these are things that are going to have spillover effects for environmental justice communities. And also it suspends new oil and natural gas leases on public lands. But if you read the bottom of the screen, so it's important for us to focus on the policy and the language, but you'll never get there. You'll never get there unless you realize the activism because a lot of the language from these documents comes straight, a lot of the claims of these documents, like the whole reason that you have an executive order 12898, look at the language of a group like the scholars and the community activists from point number 2, toxic waste and race, 1987. I can't see what you're doing right now. So if you want to pull that tab up on your browser, you're welcome to do so. I can't see you and you're not being graded right now. But you got to realize that this work was built on the backs of activists. So birthplace of the environmental justice movement after North Carolina. Hopefully everybody knows that. So it's not to say that you didn't have environmental inequality before Afton, but you never saw the galvanization. You never saw basically what became a global movement that was launched, unfortunately, on the backs of Black folk in rural North Carolina, state I used to spend some time in, former residents of North Carolina. And just look at that picture there for a second. You know, you see a couple of young ladies. I imagine those kids are in grade school. And every time I think about, you know, whether it's the young sisters in this picture or, you know, the episodes that we saw yesterday, people demanding justice in the streets, school-age children, you know, that's a commentary on this society. And when you think about the capabilities and how these young ladies are going to reach their potential every second that they're begging, not begging, but every second that they're demanding justice. I don't want those PCBs in my backyard. I don't want a landfill that's putting transformer oil in my backyard. That's minutes that they're not doing recreation activities. That's minutes that they're not studying for, you know, whatever standardized test that they're being pushed upon. So it's important to understand you have language on a federal level, but it really is a launching point from young sisters like this. A couple of things I told you to look at: toxic waste and race. Make sure you do a web search, 17 Principles of Environmental Justice. These are some of the canonical documents that anybody familiar with this discourse or wants to be familiar with this discourse needs to be comfortable with and familiar with. We're going to spend a little time talking about the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And like I said, this document was very formative in the way that New York State is talking about, or excuse me, that the federal government is talking about environmental justice. So like I said, a lot of the language is being co-opted from New York State. So that's leadership, right? You can just take a minute straight from the New York Climate Action Council. These are going to be some of the things that New York State is headed towards from an energy portfolio perspective in the coming years. So when you talk about the dimensions and the change that New York is going to engage in over the next decade, next 20 years, one thing I urge everybody to do, if you want to know about the efficacy of what this document or what this law is going to do, take a look at your energy portfolio from a state level right now. Take a look at what your energy portfolio is from a federal portfolio, from a federal perspective. Take a look at it, do a screenshot in 2021, and then come back a decade later. And if that renewable energy portfolio is still 12 or 15%, then we'll know that the CLCPA didn't do what we needed it to do. And by energy portfolio, what do I mean? So basically, your energy portfolio is going to be a pie chart or a pie graph that shows you where your different energy sources are from. So as I said before, on a federal level, about 12% of your energy use is coming from renewable sources. If you want to beat back climate change, well, number one, you're going to have to stop using so much energy. Right. So you're going to have to be a lot more efficient. You're going to have to significantly truncate your energy diet. But within the context of this, realize we are in 21st century America. Your energy diet is going to have to radically change. Natural gas, no matter what bill of goods they're selling you, other fossil fuels that are purported transition fuels. No, you're not going to designate billions of dollars of infrastructure and then say, I'm going to step away from those technologies. So renewable energy is where it's at, but also part of that conversation, you're going to have to streamline your energy diet. And renewables are going to help us do that. Now, one bone of contention that we need to talk about, let's go back to that elephant in the room. So let's just take a minute. And this is an intentionally busy PowerPoint, don't do slide. It's an intentionally busy slide. Just take a couple of seconds to look at this slide. And this is language adopted straight from New York State. And the reason I highlighted in red, disadvantaged communities, like these are going to be the communities, the environmental justice communities. This is the elephant in the room. Because when we talk about give backs, and whether it's on a federal level in New York State, we don't really tell the truth all the time, right? We say that we're going to give 40% of the wins to disadvantaged communities, but when you think about the harm that's being done, harm's not done to disadvantaged communities. Harm gets done to Black communities. harm gets done to Native communities. So if we want to keep it real, let's be real with the discourse, right? So if we think about all the problems over the 20th century that informs our current climate reality, go back, look at your redlining document. Fantastic research that's come out over the last couple of years talks about how redlining is informing urban heat islands in the 21st century context. Those documents, they didn't refer to disadvantaged communities. They referred very explicitly to Black folk, right? It referred very explicitly to Jewish community, Native communities, Latina community. So let's keep it real. Let's not use the watered down language. So if we're going to be a leader, let's lead in the right way. We don't stop with redlining documents. We can also think about racial covenants, where you can live. These documents very explicit about, well, the racism, who can and who can't live in a community. So the one bone I have to pick, not to say that the law is flawless otherwise, we got to start keeping it real when it comes to the language, right? If we're going to talk race, let's be real about race. And I think that's going to be a good stopping point. I was asked to talk for about 10 or 12 minutes. Hopefully I've stuck within those guidelines. I'm going to pass the baton back, but if you want to get in contact with me, feel free to do so from any of these means. If you want to read more about my research, I believe in the democratization of this stuff. You can read my papers, articles, and all that good stuff online at the website. So I will pass the baton back to our friend Laura. The floor is yours, colleague.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful grounding and contextualizing of our conversation today. I'll move on to introduce the rest of our panelists. Our next panelist is Rawa Gurmat-Zion. She is the Executive Director of People United for Sustainable Housing, or PUSH, Buffalo, and she's a member of the state's Climate Justice Working Group established under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Welcome, Rawa.
Thank you so much, Laura. I would like to say to Professor Lemire Tehran, that was just so fabulous. Thank you so much for that grounding. And also my colleague Sonal, who will be presenting today, is also a member of the Climate Justice Working Group. And we were just on a 2-hour phone call right before this presentation. So lots of exciting things happening there. And the struggle, of course, always continues. So my name's Rawa Gurmat-Zion. I'm the director at PUSH Buffalo. Next slide, if we can start the slide presentation, Alex. And a little bit about PUSH Buffalo. We are a community-based organization founded in 2005, working at the intersections of racial, economic, and environmental justice. And our whole goal, why we say we are just transition in action, is we are trying to practice all of the things that Lemire just told us about. And what does that look like? It looks like mobilizing residents to create strong neighborhoods with quality, affordable housing, expand local hiring opportunities, and of course, to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice in Buffalo. And we have theories of change that revolve around community control and community ownership of resources and the just transition strategy framework for transformative structural change. Well, what is a just transition? Next slide, please. Here is a wonderful infographic that explains how we all have to hold the complexity, right? And that really begins by what is the worldview of the current economy that the world is built on, right? That is an extractive economy. And it's built on, colonization, white supremacy, fossil fuel extraction, consumerism. Oftentimes, how we use our resources is that we have a very extractive dig, burn, dump, right? It's very linear. That's what we do. We can't continue to do that if we want a livable planet. We think about our work. Our work is constantly being exploited right now. Americans have never worked harder and longer and getting less money. What is, for example, our purpose? Our purpose in this country is capitalism, right? It's incredibly extractive, which means that all the wealth goes right to the top, and there's an enclosure of wealth at the top. And oftentimes people say, what is America? We are a democracy, right? Well, we want to be a democracy, but unfortunately, more than half of our budget goes to paying our military. So we actually have a governance of militarism. And so in order to continue, to address the climate crisis, the racial crisis, as well as, just our humanity, basically, is we have to divest from that power and build new systems that are actually much more regenerative, right? And so how do we do that? We do that by pulling down the resources. Unfortunately, that's what community controlled resource. We have to pull that money down in order for these shifts to happen. And we have to have a value system and a filter. And that beautiful design is a rain garden. Rain gardens oftentimes do things like take all the water that Mother Earth provides in rain and puts it back into the earth the way it's supposed to. It helps to remediate toxic soil. It helps to make green spaces, urban farms, all of these things a real reality, right? And cleaning up our water sources. And we do that by shifting economic control down to communities. We have to relocalize most production and consumption. We have to address racial justice. We have to address ecological justice. And we want, of course, to embed all of these in our cultural heritage and traditions. Much more to say about that. And then, of course, what is the worldview that we want? We need to center caring and sacredness and a feminist ethical care approach. And that is really just our humanity. What is our purpose? We want ecological well-being and social cohesion. What is our resources? We need them to be regenerative. Our work must be cooperative. And if we really want governance, we have to redistribute how we think about power and governance, localize everything, and practice deep democracy together. This is not easy. It's a practice. It's not about perfection. Next slide, please. And how do we do that here at PUSH? By centering the people first, by trusting them. The most impacted people, we often say, we know what we want where we live, and we have a lot of swagger about that. We have a lot of local knowledge, local expertise, and we believe that the people closest to the problem have the best solutions. Next slide, please. Here's how we've been able to demonstrate that. That right there is a beautiful map of the Green Development Zone. We work very much with a place-based approach, but our work is local, national, and across the state. And what we've done here is we've had some very big policy and organizing wins. We took those organizing wins and turned them into economic development opportunities by engaging the residents, taking control of the land and building quality, affordable green housing, doing things like weatherization and, taking, national fuel, suing them and getting money and creating legislation across the state to provide weatherization across our communities. And every single one of those is a thread towards training and upskilling men and women from our neighborhood into these good family sustaining jobs and negotiating their community benefits agreements. Next slide, please. And here is a great video that illustrates how we won the most advanced climate legislation in the country. Oh, we can't hear it. I think you have to change the sound.
Climate change has always been here. Environmental racism has always been here. But now we have an opportunity to step towards ecological justice. One thing that I've learned is that nobody's going to come to save us. And there are so many pressing problems in our communities, in our daily lives that do not get heard. So we're really shifting the narrative as to who's doing this work and why we're doing it. Right here in Buffalo, we have a movement that's spurring for climate justice.
So the Climate and Community Protection Act calls to set into law the commitments that have already been made by our governor for 100% renewable energy by 2050.
Who's next? Who's next? Who's help? Who's help? No more delay. That's what I'm talking about.
Buffalo remains one of the poorest cities in the country and one of the most racially segregated. The work PUSH does to bridge that divide really starts with people. We believe in building community power, working to implement our solutions here on the ground.
People will pay more for their utility expense during the cold months than they do their rent or their mortgage. We at PUSH Buffalo are working to change every aspect of that. And so what we have is a community-controlled economy that we call the Green Development Zone.
Since the Green Development Zone was created, we've been able to train several hundred men and women from our community in green jobs, jobs in the solar industry, jobs in energy efficiency and weatherization. Green jobs pay living wages. They're open and accessible to folks who've been historically marginalized, folks of color, women, immigrant refugee populations, returning citizens, veterans. Green jobs are the jobs of the future. School 77 is a mixed-use affordable housing project that includes 30 units of energy-efficient affordable housing for senior citizens in our community, and that creates access to clean, renewable energy, and to us is a shining example of energy democracy in action.
Seeing people that are within this community be the ones to install that is amazing. It not only redefines what it is to have a good green job, it redefines who it is that has access to these good green jobs, and then expanding on our education about what it is that is needed for this just transition.
Real people have real power. What we are trying to do is be in right relationship with ourselves, be in right relationship with our communities, and be in right relationship with Mother Earth. We want to take what we are doing in our neighborhood and bring it to scale across the state to everyone's neighborhood.
Great. Next slide. And I'm going to move very quickly. So we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in June 2019. We are not done. Next slide, please. And now we need to be able to pay for it. What are these 40% of investments? And we are working very hard between investments and overall benefits and what is a disadvantaged community and all of that as we are setting the criteria as part of the Climate Justice Working Group. It's going to be a fight, but the reality is we need to generate revenue and we need to hold the people that caused all of this pollution in our communities accountable. Next slide, please. The CCIA, if passed, which has been introduced both in the Senate and the Assembly, would generate about $15 billion to be invested in communities to do exactly what we're doing at Push Buffalo. Next slide, please. And of course, when we stand together, we win together. Thank you.
What a beautiful message. Thanks for that insight into your work, and thank you for that work. Our next panelist is Nikki Hilton Patterson, the inaugural director of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, where she seeks to equip communities in the North Country with tools, strategies, and the language to dismantle systemic racism and structural inequality. Welcome, Nikki.
Your mute button. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am, as Laura said, I am the inaugural director for the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. We don't have as much feet on the ground and knowledge and expertise as any of my other panelists. Thank you for doing the work, for being on the ground, for never giving up and making a way so that I could come here and do the work I'm doing. Okay, thank you. So the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, just some quick background, was birthed out of a desire to make the Adirondacks more welcoming and inclusive. Very simple. In 2014, a group of white allies, activists, accomplices, co-conspirators convened a symposium, a diversity symposium. And out of that, they decided that they needed to come together and create the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. It was all volunteer run for several years until 2018, when they finally petitioned and got $250,000 from the Department of Environmental Conservation. And so that was, that fund helped to hire a director, myself, and a staff of 1.5. So I was hired on the 3rd of December, 2019. And so I'm not quite 2 years old yet, but we've been hitting the ground running. We exist at the intersection of environmental and transformational justice. And so I am probably the least, in terms of my background as an environmental scientist or activist, I'm probably the least knowledgeable person here. But we who are Black know that environmental racism is destructive to our entire way of being, right? And Dr. Tamor started off by asking, what would it take to get a Black person a full-time or tenure track professorship at a university? I can tell you about that, Dr. Tehran. I decided not to go there because of the kind of emotional, physical, and spiritual labor that it takes for a Black woman to even get into a PhD program, right? And so if you're talking about environmental justice, the ways that where we have to live. So I'm coming out of a multi-family situation in the Bronx, right? So there were 16 people living in 2 bedrooms while I was doing my master's, right? And we understand that if we understand the statistics around children with asthma, with different kinds of comorbidities that are easily avoidable because of the ways in which we've been garrisoned, if you will. It's a Jamaican word for segregation. Garrison. The ways we've been garrisoned, the ways in which our communities are not given enough resources to face environmental degradation. I live right by the Bronx Park, and I can tell you now, if my child or my dogs fell into that park, I would take them to the doctor right away because it's severely polluted. And this is where the homeless, and if you live in the Bronx, you know the kinds of pollution that comes out of the Bronx and the ways in which our schools are, during COVID shutdown, I was here. And many of the schools were able to continue, right? They were able to stagger kids, have them come in 2 to 3 days. They couldn't do that in most of the Bronx schools. You know why? When you have 40 kids in a classroom, you can't do that. When you are told that you have to make significant changes to your air and water, and you didn't have the money to begin with, and this was a problem before COVID, right? Then there's no way that that child can get the same education in the same environment, or anyone, that the child in the Adirondacks. The children in the Adirondacks were well taken care of during COVID, not so for the children in the Bronx. Okay, now quickly, I want to go back to environmental issue. Particularly, my approach to environmentalism is one that speaks to decolonizing environmentalism. And I just want to quickly, without any slides, give you a definition for colonialism and one for decoloniality, okay? So my definition that I'm using for colonialism occurs when a country or a nation takes control of other lands, regions, or territories outside of its borders of a country, by turning those other lands, religions, or territories into a colony, right? Now, coloniality requires, right, that the ongoing process of non-native settlers occupying native land, demanding their worldviews, morals, and economies be followed while attempting to erase and assimilate the original inhabitants. This is my approach to environmental justice, that environmental justice needs to be decolonized so that we are not, as environmental justice advocates, we are not reproducing knowingly and unknowingly the same tropes, same practices, policies that got us here to begin with, right? That we are not, in doing our work, putting the burden of environmental justice on Black and Brown and Indigenous bodies to carry that weight. And that's our position at ADI. That is my political philosophy, right? For example, if we start with the idea, I'm in the Adirondacks. The Adirondacks has many, many spaces that are protected as protected wildernesses. The idea of wilderness is a colonial idea. That is a colonial idea. For something to be designated a protected wilderness, you must acknowledge, you must believe, A, that there are no human bodies on there, right? And what does that mean? In order for that to be protected wilderness, you had to clear out the bodies that were there first. So you had to destabilize entire communities, and I'm talking about Indigenous bodies, to declare the site a wilderness. And then what happens after you declared a wilderness? You declared a state park. Now, there is an argument going around whether or not state parks should be returned to the First Nations peoples. And that's an argument to be had, right? But what I want us to think through, even as we're talking about environmental justice and environmental racism, is whether or not we have internalized the colonial project and are reproducing the same kinds of tropes, arguments, and practices in order to destabilize or to stabilize the climate for our people, right? So that is very critically important. what does it mean to internalize colonialism? Internal colonialism is the uneven effects of economic development on a regional basis, otherwise known as uneven development, as a result of the exploitation of minority groups, I call it minoritized groups, within a wider society, and leading to political and economic equalities, right? What do I mean? We want to approach colonialism or environmental justice from a decolonial perspective, right? What do we do? What do we mean by decoloniality? The action and practice of dismantling harmful structures of power, reclaiming previous subjectivities, and envisioning a future built on previous and current understandings of compassion, relation, and accountability. Post-coloniality focuses, when it focuses on environmental justice, on the human consequences of control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. We need to center traditional ways of knowing the land, traditional practices, and acknowledge that what we are trying to dismantle now was created by colonialism, and neoliberal capitalism helps to perpetuate the continued degradation of our environment and puts the burden on Black and brown folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for offering us that language and lens. Appreciate that. Last, but certainly not least, our fourth panelist is Sonal Jessel, the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. She's also a member of the state's Climate Justice Working Group and holds an MPH in Population and Family Health with a concentration in Climate and Health from Columbia University. Welcome.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to all the panelists and Professor Taryn for your wonderful, knowledge setting for all of us. It's always a great reminder about the history of environmental justice. And as a sort of younger person in this field, I always am very thankful for all the work that everyone has done in this field, as well as in the civil rights movement and the fight for racial justice and all of the different movements that are really intertwined with environmental justice. So my name is Sonal again. I'm the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. And just a quick overview of who we are. We are a community-based organization based in Northern Manhattan in Harlem, West Harlem of New York City. We represent the catchment areas of Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood, which are all neighborhoods that are predominantly low income, predominantly Black, African American, or Latinx. And in our work, we organize for fighting environmental injustices, fighting environmental racism, and building healthy communities. And so we do that through city policy, state policy, and federal policy, which I know we will be talking about today. So just a little bit about the importance of this work for We Act as an organization that's been doing this work since 1988. We originally got our start by organizing against a toxic facility being placed in the neighborhood that was already dealing with a brunt of other toxic facilities already in the neighborhood that were already polluting communities and contributing to poor health outcomes for the residents in the neighborhood. And what we found was that asthma rates were incredibly high in Harlem and New York City. It was like, at one point, I believe it was around 10 times higher of asthma rates than other parts of the city. Now it's much lower, but it's still a huge disparity. And that in part is due to a lot of organizing around reducing the amount of toxic facilities in the neighborhoods, making sure that they are at least in the least up to code and not polluting, so without any kind of regulation, and also contributing, investing, and undoing the lack of resourcing that communities were given historically over, decades or hundreds of years in many places that have made communities less healthy. So one thing that we point to a lot, especially lately as more and more research comes out about this, is redlining and the history of what redlining did to communities and how that is actually contributing to environmental health disparities now. So We Act works really heavily in the issue of extreme heat. That's something that we focus on a lot as a major climate justice issue, where it is Black and African American people that are actually hospitalized or visiting the emergency room or even having premature mortality due to heat in New York City more than any other race of people. And a lot of that has to do with their built environment, with their access to energy. Like Ra was talking about, that's why we're very involved in energy efficiency and weatherization work and access to cooling, and ideally sustainable cooling, as a way to protect communities that do not have the resources or haven't been given the resources that they deserve for a very, very long time. So part of the history of redlining has been a lack of investment in parks, for example. So we have Central Harlem, which, while it is close to Central Park and there are some parks there, they might be poorly maintained, or they might be many blocks away. So people that are dealing with a chronic health condition on a really hot day don't really feel like they can walk 10 blocks to a park, for example. So they need spaces that are closer by and more prevalent throughout the community. Not to mention, some of the parks are kind of fully cement, which does not help with combating extreme heat if your park is cement and not green space. So this is just one of the topics that WEAC works on as a way to combat what we know has been historical environmental racism that has existed in our community for a very long time. And I'm trying to be brief. I'm going to end this by saying some things that WEAC works on in the policy world in response to a lot of environmental racism is the CLCPA, which we will talk about today. How do we define who these disadvantaged communities are that are going to receive investment? How do we make sure that investment happens? And how do we make sure that it's tracked and that the investment actually leads to success in what we were trying to do for communities, and not sort of let that run away from us. Part of that includes fighting for funding, like Bravo mentioned, the CCIA. Part of that includes ensuring that there's not a lot of silo between how we can address energy issues that low-income communities are faced with, that when we transition away from fossil fuels, how do we make sure we're not leaving communities behind? Additionally, on the federal level, we work on a lot of policies that includes the Environmental Justice for All Act. That's very important to our organization. Particularly, that's addressing this theory of this idea of cumulative impacts is not a theory, it's very real. This idea of cumulative impacts where, like I said, communities are dealing with lots of different toxic facilities or a lot of different contributing hazards on top of each other, and dealing with the health burden of having a lot of these sites built on them. So something WEAC is really focusing on, even on a state level. This is something that's a bill that exists in New York State that we want to pass, is not allowing the continuation of developers, of owners of facilities to be continually placing their toxic facilities in neighborhoods that have been dealing with the brunt of environmental hazards for all of history. So that's something that's very important to us, and we're excited to talk about today. And just overarchingly, we are finding that the discussion of environmental justice is now coming back into sort of the popular lexicon, which has been a very interesting process for, I'm sure, everyone here, as you notice being kind of pulled into more rooms and sitting at more tables to talk about this. And it's definitely an interesting process of grappling with how are we upholding our values in a space that is, kind of like what Nikki was saying, not exactly built for these communities to be a part of in the first place. So it's been a very interesting process, and I look forward to talking about it. Thank you all.
Thank you. As we transition into the question and answer portion of the program, I just want to remind audience members that they can submit questions in the Q&A function that's found at the bottom of the taskbar in the Zoom window. And so if and as we have time, hopefully we'll incorporate those into the discussion. Our first question, going back to our keynote and jumping off of that a little bit, how can we understand the lack of resulting action following the 1994 executive order on environmental justice that scholars and practitioners have observed? What lessons, policies, and practices should we take from those continued and disparate environmental health harms on poor communities and communities of color? And I guess as a follow-up to that, if we can also touch on the new executive order that Lemire mentioned, and the degree to which that policy is similar to or different from the earlier EO? Rawa, did you want to jump in?
I can certainly jump in. So when we have executive orders, they are not laws, right? So I think what the movement has learned is oftentimes when we've had policy wins in the past, we don't have any teeth. So what we did, for example, for the CLCPA that passed, is that we were already thinking about an implementation strategy, and that's actually built into the law, which is why we've got the Climate Action Council, so on and so forth, right? And we created a sister bill because we knew we had to also have we have to be able to generate revenue in order to pay for the harm that's been done to communities. I think similarly, the Biden administration is certainly using a lot of the sort of language from New York and other frontline and EJ communities. The proof will always be in the pudding. But the thing about executive orders, even if Biden is successful, and I'm always cautiously optimistic, we'll see, is that they are moving incredibly fast. So I don't know how they're going to do all the real good work that it takes, talking to frontline community folks that have been doing this for decades and decades, for example. If we're not informing it, then it's probably not going to be that great. It's just going to be another neoliberal agenda. But more importantly, when it's a law, from administration to administration, you can't walk it back as you do with executive orders.
I can add, I think that's one of the big differences is that with this renewed commitment is coming down the pipeline a lot of other policies that I would say, like kind of like Ro was saying, we're more interested in that, what gets passed and codified. That is very interesting. And so that comes, for example, with what the federal government is calling Justice 40 initiative, which does come from the CLCPA language around 40% of investments go to disadvantaged communities. So there's this very clear commitment there. That is very much in the process of being figured out how to turn that into law and give it that teeth. And I think that's very different from what occurred in the first environmental justice executive order.
Great, thank you both. Broadening out just a little bit from there, given the general focus at the federal and state policy level on climate change, renewable energy, and infrastructure that we have at this moment, what environmental justice provisions or practices do you see as critical components of those related policies? And what kind of processes should we be implementing in order to develop those policies in the first place? To borrow from Nikki's language, I think, to decolonize perhaps those processes.
I want to start with looking at, I think before we even talk about policy and why the 1994 one didn't have any teeth is because of the way we've been not recognizing. The colonial project was not about shared humanity, right? It was about forwarding or advancing a definition or a living definition of humanity that didn't include Black and brown people and indigenous peoples, right? So if you think about policies coming down, even executive orders, right? If we haven't contended with how we treat human beings to begin with, then those policies are not going to work because they're not going to attend to housing. They're not going to attend to the ways in which Black women or Black mothers are always and will always be seen as welfare queens because of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's welfare speech on the Senate floor in the 80s. It's not going, and so if you feel that the poor, the Black and the brown are undeserving, right? Then even in the writing of those policies, it's not going to be as holistic because you do not consider the people for whom the policies are meant to protect. That's my challenge to our environmentalists right here now, is to start from scratch. Policymakers need to have voices at the table from communities who are disproportionately impacted by climate degradation. And that's not happening. And when we talk about decolonizing environmentalism, we're really speaking about hiring a capacity. And when I say capacity, I mean having more people like Dr. Tamor, having more people like Rawa, having more people like Sonal at the tables when, before, and at the onset of crafting these laws. So we understand lived realities of the people to whom we are hoping to protect and serve with these policies.
Let me just offer a couple of quick things. Green jobs is going to be the name of the game. Being careful not to get caught up in the hierarchies and the hierarchical processes that Nikki was talking about earlier. I live in a region of the state where Black folk have been systematically and effectively locked out of and excluded from multiple labor markets, whether you're talking about the trades, banking and finance, law. So we can go on and on. So we have to keep in mind, in the words of my brilliant brother, Julian Adjament, we need a just sustainabilities. It's not enough just to create sustainable jobs. We need to have sustainable jobs with an environmental justice agenda. Part two of this, I think all of our colleagues have clearly laid out what does the transition framework look, sound, and act like. Go down to WEAC in New York. Our sister was very explicit on this is what the transition is going to look like. We realize with the public health consequences, we have a template for doing so. Our colleague out in Buffalo, same thing. So whether we're talking about weatherization, rain gardens, we need to think about what does the next 10 years look like. We can't just be sustainable. We have to be just and sustainable. And then while we're doing that, we always need to think about the big environmental picture. We need to think about concurrent environmental problems. Yes, very easy to focus on climate change, but when you're going into that house to do weatherization, let's make sure we're remediating the lead paint as well. Very easy to have a transportation strategy that gets cars off the road. Let's make sure that we're putting bike lanes, not just into the college community. Let's make sure we're putting those bike lanes in communities that have historically and disproportionately depended on non-automotive transport. And we need to be real about that, right? Because we look at a certain sector, or certain so-called class of society, they're being environmentalists. But our community have depended on alternative modes of transportation for years, but they're never giving deference in terms of the language as being environmentalists. So just very easily, our sisters have given you the template. All you got to do is take notes. As a matter of fact, they should be teaching my class tomorrow.
I love that. If I could just add one other thing, it's kind of like, nuanced in there, but I think we need to be explicit, is this idea of ownership and how we think about business, right? Is that we should be communities, should have microgrids, we should own, we should build and maintain our renewable infrastructure, the transition, right? So if they're talking about, plug-in automobiles, like I want to own the actual system where you need to come and plug it through my neighborhood, especially if there's a bus fleet coming through, whatever it is. But that's what's also going to help us with our consumer mindset. Regardless of what happens in this transition, we all have to learn how to live with less, period. That's the only way that we're going to be able to be thinking 7 generations ahead. And so in order to do that, if I have a connection to something, I have buy-in, I'm going to be interested in it, and I'm going to want to know how it works, right? There's an interest. People want to know, where does their power come from? It should come from the community, and they should own it. They should have access to it. That is the way we build healthy, equitable, thriving communities.
Great, thank you all. The next question touches back on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019 that a few of you already spoke to, and the provisions under it that direct agency funding towards quote unquote disadvantaged communities, establish the Climate Action Council, and within the Just Transition Working Group and Climate Justice Working Group, of which a couple of you are a part. What are the implications and potential impacts of these policies with respect to environmental justice in New York State moving forward? And how will we know, I know Lemire, you touched on this a little bit, how will we know if this policy and its component parts are having their intended impacts? And perhaps we can start with Sonal and Rawa, since you're on one of these groups.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's complicated. I'll sum up, I'll say some pieces of it, but knowing that I'm not touching on even close to everything. I think, you have to start to me, in my mind, I think I'm like, you have to start with the definitions. What does it mean to get a benefit? What does it mean to be disadvantaged? What does it mean to get investment? You know, we have to be really strict and have our eyes wide open around how those things are defined and what that actually leads to in terms of, you know, funding or projects or programs or infrastructure that gets put into communities that are, you know, part of this definition of disadvantaged. So I think that's sort of the first thing, is how do we make sure that it's going to the right place to begin with, and it's the right things are going to the right place to begin with, because that term benefit is still kind of a little bit open and is something that people are actively talking about. What is the definition of that? What does that actually mean? And in terms of ensuring that it's being used correctly, that's where guardrails are so important. That's where having a say as people that either represent community or from community, or, you know, consistently speak with community or bring community into the process. What does it mean to have something work? Like, what does that success actually look like, and how should that be measured and determined? I think is really important. Oftentimes, government picks some kind of very basic ways of tracking where they send these quote unquote benefits, but what's important is also thinking about what is an equitable model for measuring success. Which can be very complicated, can include a lot more time and investment in talking to people and actually finding out, going to that community and seeing what this investment has looked like, seeing how it's actually being deployed and used, and asking people if they like it. So it takes more time, but it's something that is really, really important for us to plan for, I think. And that's really a big part of the CLCPA conversation that is starting to happen, but needs to definitely be happening more.
Yeah, and if I could just add everything that Sonal said, number one, thank you for your brilliance always. I think that what the CAC and the different working groups and advisory panels do, it gives us an inside track to organizing on the inside, right? Because we always have to have an inside and outside strategy. That is always going to be key, because justice demands nothing. I mean, you know, you can't get justice without a demand, and that's always the case. I think what's like really beautiful and again, cautiously optimistic about the CLCPA is that it allows for an iterative and evolving process. There will be key moments every so many years where we will have to assess and get the data back to see if the benefits are actually happening. The thing that we are fighting for right now at the forefront, and hopefully we will be successful, is really defining in real terms, what are the investments that get us to the goals of the benefits that we are seeking, and defining that very clearly within the Climate Justice Working Group. Some of the criteria that we're also using in New York State, we're lucky enough that we can actually use race as a marker, which they cannot do in California. We're also, and thank you, Dr. Taryn, or Professor Taryn, is that we also are using things like redlining maps, you know, looking at all of those things to actually get us to even more of that ground truthing to address who a disadvantaged community is. The other thing is we have to demand from the tables that we're a part of, who's missing. And what is like glaringly, obviously missing within the CLCPA are Indigenous communities. And New York Renews, the organization that actually helped to craft this bill and get it passed, is now very, you know, in a mutual way, working with Indigenous tribal leaders across this state. And we actually just submitted something to the Climate Justice Working Group, which we hope will be accepted. And what we are asking for there is, we will not speak for Indigenous people. We will work in mutuality and in collaboration with them, but that they need to dictate and lead the way, is that they should have their own body within the CAC working groups or advisory panels. So I'm just saying that because we want that to be an outside organizing strategy, and maybe all of you will help us push both from the outside and the inside to make that happen.
Great. Since we're talking about strategizing and organizing here, we got a question from an audience member on that issue, who asked, how can we begin to build a coalition of upstate and downstate to kind of inventory the issues and strategize so that partisan voices don't continue to define issues and separate all of these communities?
We already are. So get involved with one of them. So if you're in housing, there's the Housing for All Coalition, which is upstate, downstate, and everything in between. New York Renews now has over 200 member organizations. And then within that, there's even like pockets of regional coalitions and what have you. And I think that has been the really beautiful and most powerful thing, is that when we stand together, we win together, and we win in really big ways. Can we do more of it? Absolutely. Is it perfect? That's never the goal.
Great. And another one that ties into one of our questions from an audience member who is asking about banking and financial institutions and their role here. How can we think about funding for such policies like the CLCPA and others at the state and federal level? And are there good examples of such investments that have been impactful that we can kind of look to as benchmarks?
So can I just quickly talk about, so before COVID locked us down, the governor had brought forward the Restore Mother Nature Act, Bond Act, $3 billion, right? So, and I'm not sure where that went, whether or not it was supposed to be a ballot measure or something, but I think the most important thing that we can do is be more informed. We must be informed, right? And so I want to also talk about this one thing. So last 2016, I walked with my mother, because my mother is what you would consider functionally illiterate, right? And I had to go with her to the ballot boxes, and there was an environmental justice measure on there. The language was so fucking dense, pardon my language. The language was so dense that, and if you're talking about our communities, and I'm going to speak for my community, immigrant, Black, English as second language communities, right? If you understand who our communities are, our kinship formations don't look like the traditional Anglo-American formation. Many of us are second language learners, second English language learners. Many of our adults need assistance, yet you write these environmental justice proposals and measures. It's so dense and inaccessible to our own people, you know? So what I would like to ask our audience to do is become knowledgeable. There are many agencies. Rawa talked about it. I would like to make a push for the Conservationists of Color or Bronx River Initiative. Those are two very robust. They're working hard on the ground. And I really do need you to become knowledgeable. And also for my environmental justice friends, remember that when we're speaking to our people, make sure the language is accessible. I don't even use terms like colonialism and environmental justice with my folks. I talk about their lived realities and how and translate that into what impacts them on a day-to-day basis. Knowledge, fluency, and doing the work and seeking out those people, those of us who are on the ground doing the work.
Just to address the last question, we need financial mechanisms to make sure that technical capacity that exists within our communities has access to finance. You can think about the racist dimensions of PPP, and we saw discriminatory lending in that process. That can't be the case. We know that there are plenty of groups and communities. I was out in Buffalo not that long ago, before COVID, and just looking at the technical capacity of an organization like PUSH. Organizations like that need to have access to financing without the racist and racialized middlemen and middle women who work in these banks. So maybe that means that we need to be a lot more energetic and creative in getting monies filtered through credit unions, through community-driven organizations. But the one thing I do know, we have the technical on-the-ground capacity. And where we don't, we need to do a better job of training folks. Like I said, I think the PUSH has the secret sauce. One of the most remarkable things I've ever seen, I was out there and I saw a guy, the brother was leading the solar installations, and on the work crew, his son and daughter, and they were of age. I don't want you to think these were 12 and 13-year-old kids. Maybe they were 19 and 22, but his son and daughter, and I think they were on college break, but his son and daughter were getting that technical installation capacity. So we need to make sure that we're using community-owned and operated financial institutions to make sure that money gets filtered into those Black, brown, Native organizations who have the capacity and do have the capacity.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I agree with what both Nikki and Professor Turan said, that first of all, the case is for community, both with helping provide financing for projects or advocating for financing for projects, but also like the literacy component and the communications component is really important. And I think that's something that as a membership-based organization, we always try to do, is communicate with our members what's going on in a way that is accessible, but also in a way that's answering any questions that they have, or reacting to any really valid concerns that exist as well too. And I think that's a very important part of community-based organizations, is doing that on the ground work that takes time and takes effort and takes care to really just talk to people. And in the COVID era, that's gotten much harder, but we still do it. Another thing that's brought out is just the need for better digital literacy, for example, internet access. You'd be surprised. A lot of places in New York City struggle with that. These are the things that are so, so important. And then I'll also say, with respect to sort of community investment, for example, we ACT has a solar training program that we've run in the past couple of years. We've trained over 100 or so people in our community in solar installation. And that came through a partnership with the solar installation businesses and we ACT, bringing in community members and sort of communicating with community members about this prospect, about the importance of it, about the lack of Black and African American people in the solar industry, and the opportunity for being in the front of a growing industry. And that is very promising to people, that excites people. And what's happened in a result, in part because of racist hiring practices where people were struggling getting jobs in solar, was the creation of a solar worker cooperative that we now have a lot of our solar workers that came through our program have now put together, called the Solar Uptown Now services. They run their own business. They make their own contracts. They install the solar, and it's all community solar. So it goes back to the community that they installed it in. So to us, that is really the, creme de la creme of doing this work. That's so important that it's now, we helped communicate that information, but then people took it and ran with it, absolutely ran with it, which is ideal.
So clearly Sonal thinks I'm 100 years old because she keeps calling me professor. Yes, I acknowledge the pandemic has given me a couple of grades, but come on, Sonal, please stop it.
I think we've all added a few grays over the last year. The next question I wanted to ask, and there's an audience member who's asking a similar question, so I'll tie these together. To what degree and in what ways do more recent environmental justice policies, proposals, and practices reflect intersectional concerns related to labor, gender, immigration, and other axes of identity and experience? And in particular, our audience member is interested in the disability community and if and how they're represented through the CLCPA groups and other policies and proposals.
So I'm not going to be able to comment on the CLCPA, but our ADI is working with the High Peaks Advisory Group in the Adirondacks, specifically about the overuse of the peaks, right? The high peaks. And the marketing of that language and talking about who are the people overusing the peaks. They surely ain't no Black people, And so their suggestion was to come up with a permit system, but the permit system costs money. And if you know anything about hiking, you have to have hiking gear. If you know anything about traveling while Black, you have to be willing to leave New York City to travel upstate and risk the police harassment because you're driving while you're Black or brown. Let's just be real honest, right? Once you get through that, the kinds of ignorance, implicit bias, and straight up racism that you face in the park as you are trying to get to that is another hindrance. But that we have been working with them to talk about whether or not that permit system is going to further exclude Black and brown and low income people from accessing these public spaces, right? So that is an important thing. And we started working with the Americans with Disabilities services in the community to talk about making sure that when we're talking about access, we're also talking about persons who are differently abled. Okay, the fact that even a lot of these public spaces are still not accessible, and I'm not talking about high peaks. I'm talking about just different paths that people can take, waterways. They're still not accessible, and so this is something that we're going to be working with the DEC to make sure that we are increasing access for different persons who are differently abled in the park.
I just wanted to add, specifically in the CLCPA, there are provisions as part of the Just Transition working group you will see addressed are people with different abilities, women in these industries, and as well as people that are currently working within the fossil fuel infrastructure economy, coal-fired burning plants and things like that, that we are protecting the transition if there's an early retirement at the same level kind of thing, or training them into new jobs that will be available in the renewable economy, as well as making sure that communities do not lose their tax base from what it currently is as a result of the closures of those plants. So it does try to be all encompassing. We'll see, of course, in the implementation how that goes. Similarly, the Climate and Community Investment Act, that $15 billion, very much has worker rights for all kinds of folks, including Black and brown people, opportunities for training, paying them while they're being trained, women, as I said, and it includes things like childcare, which is a huge barrier for people, transportation, being paid while being trained. But additionally, it also addresses, because we in EJ communities have to think across social determinants of health, have to address multiple issues. And as our very good friend, Audre Lorde always reminds us, be careful of the single issue, because none of us are single issues, and that everything in these systems are connected. So what we've done in the CCIA is really think about justice and recovery by making sure that even though the CLCPA says that this is economy-wide, you will not be able to use these dollars to go towards building renewable energy in prison systems, transitioning police fleets. Similarly, we want to create a whole new authority so that these funds are not being rated by municipalities and they are being directed exactly to where they're supposed to go, including helping women and families and children and childcare as part of that infrastructure provision.
Wonderful. What a nice reminder. Thank you, Rawa. As we kind of move towards the end of our time, I want to ask one final question for everybody. What are some of the other new policies and practices that you now see on the horizon or that you would like to see on the horizon with respect to environmental justice in New York State and at the federal level? Where should we be looking to next?
I can start. There's a couple things. At New York State, a couple of things that we ACT is really pushing for and working on are a few bills, one of which is called the Energy Efficiency Equity for All Act. It's a long name, but it basically is doing, you know, what we've been talking about, which is breaking down the silos between weatherizing a building, but also addressing mold and lead issues. So that bill is really focused on it with a major focus on job investment and mandating proportions of jobs being for community members and making sure that people are not left behind in that process. The other bills that we're really excited about are around this cumulative impacts idea that I've mentioned before, that we talked about before. There is one at the New York State level that wouldn't allow permitting for new facilities and new developments if it's contributing to an existing burden. So it's taking in the cumulative impact, which we're also really excited about. So those are two things on New York State. In terms of the federal level, our WEAC team in DC is incredibly busy with lots of things these days, which has been really exciting for us. But there's a lot of different issues that they are really uplifting. One is around legacy pollution, which is a bill that existed last year on the Environmental Justice Legacy Pollution Cleanup Act from Senator Booker. This year, it's being reintroduced and increasing the funding above $100 billion for cleaning up coal mines, brownfields, formerly used areas for, military use. So all of these different places that are now just toxic and are disproportionately in our communities of color. And the other pieces that we're pursuing are, we'd like to create an Office of Cumulative Impacts at the federal level that is really overseeing the development and implementation of safeguards regarding cumulative impacts that include a very, very strict focus on environmental health, which is something WEACT really focuses on, is the health impacts. And so there's a lot that we have here federally, but those are just the ones that I'll mention now. But we're generally also really excited about a lot of infrastructure funding that we think is really important for New York City, particularly for that money to go to NYCHA, the public housing that has been disinvested for so long. It's something we particularly focus on. We need billions of dollars to upgrade and improve housing, public housing in New York City. And a lot of that is because we have poorly maintained buildings, mold, pests, lead, dust, dander, all of the things you can imagine, plus power outages, temperature extremes. We need to electrify NYCHA by use of renewable energy. And that's something we're very excited to get funding to do.
I won't attempt to follow that. I'll simply say we're in a time of transition. I work at a major research university. If you're interested in the integration of the environmental sciences, sustainability, and environmental justice, come study at my school. I need you. These institutions, including my university, needs to change. And the only way it's going to change is when we're at the table. And no, we don't want a superficial seat at the table where you can be exploited and used for a photo op. We want you meaningfully at the table. I need you meaningfully at the table. So I think we have a brilliant collective of minds. I just happen to show up today. We're going to continue to work together. And let's make sure everybody on this call, let's make sure that this is not the last time. And I challenge one last thing, Laura and the Rock Institute. Let's make sure the next panel and the panel after that, it's very easy to assemble brown talent when you're doing things based around issues that obviously have racial manifestations. Let's make sure that we get the brown panel when we're doing a topic on something that's seemingly race neutral. We know that nothing in this society is race neutral, but when we have a topic that's a little bit more remote from race, let's make sure that we have a constitution of our panel that looks very similar and dynamic to this one.
Wow. Everybody is amazing on this panel. You guys are really hard to follow, be the follow-up too. I would say that I'm going to start with the national stuff first. There is a lot, the Thrive sort of coalition of folks that are together versus the Thrive legislation that's recently been introduced in Congress. It's challenging because I don't think that is what the Thrive folks, like that's, the EJ folks are really into, but it is something at the federal level. So I think that's something to look out for and really exciting. Obviously for us here in New York State, it's really about the CCIA and the passage of that, because then that gives us the resource that we need to continue to implement much more quickly the ideas and solutions we already have. And then another big thing to really watch out for is the homes guarantee. That is being introduced at the federal level. We have to house everybody. It's a basic human right. Another thing is addressing water accessibility, affordability, and infrastructure, and protecting the health of our water. And then on a very, very kind of small scale, but I think it's going to have a huge impact, is this amazing project that Push is working on with WEACT called the Out of Gas Campaign. We are doing a pilot project in North Manhattan and in Buffalo, New York, where we are going to transition 40 families total, 20 in each community, from gas to induction ovens, install air quality monitors and assess it, as well as heat pump technology. And we'll be able to have some core data to help us understand What will it actually take to transition the most impacted people in our communities? What are the cost implications possibly and other implications, so that we are being prepared to insert that into the policy requests that we are advocating for? And that is really, really exciting. So tune in.
Great. Thank you all so much. Some wonderful projects, policies, and challenges to look forward to. I appreciate you all so much for being here. I want to say thank you to all of our audience members who have stayed with us through this conversation, and especially extend a thank you to all of our panelists for sharing of their time, experience, and expertise with us today. Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about as we look forward to Earth Day tomorrow. So I want to wish everybody a wonderful day and a happy Earth Day. Thank you all. Thank you so Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was a good crowd, I think. And I was serious when I kind of put that call out there. We're not still on, are we? Or maybe we are. Mm-mm. Yeah, I was just going to simply say I put the call out there. Let's make sure that this is not the last time we collaborate. It seems like we have some momentum and some synergy. So I definitely look forward to working with you and the co-panelists at some point moving forward.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We're going to close out.
All right. Take care.
Take care.